Not a digital signal, not a quantum-encoded frequency burst, not a holographic projection delivered through a council relay drone. Paper, actual paper, folded twice, sealed with a plain wax stamp, and hand-delivered by a council courier who looked deeply uncomfortable about the whole thing. Arda read it at her kitchen table before the rest of the building had woken up. Outside her window, the city moved slowly. A garbage truck groaned down the street. A dog barked twice and went quiet. Somewhere a child was already crying about something small and important. The letter told her she had 30 days to appear before the Galactic Council's Grand Assembly and sign the compliance accord on behalf of the human species. She folded it back along its original creases and put it under her coffee cup to use as a coaster. 3 weeks later, she was on a shuttle heading toward a station so large it had its own weather systems inside. The council had built it 600 years ago when they believed architecture was a form of argument. Every corridor was designed to make visitors feel small. The ceilings were 40 meters high. The floors were polished black stone that reflected everything back at you, slightly distorted. The air smelled like something between a library and a hospital. Arda walked through it with her hands in her jacket pockets. Her aide, a young man named Dav, walked beside her and kept checking his tablet. He had been briefed 14 times on council protocol. He knew which direction to bow, how long to pause before speaking, and which topics were considered spiritually offensive to the Dravi delegation. Arda had read none of the briefing documents. She had spent the journey reading a book about soil erosion on the eastern steppe. The Grand Assembly Hall held 11 species. Each had a tiered section rising up from the central floor like the inside of a coliseum. The seats were full. Every delegate, every aide, every observer from every council member world was present. The message was clear. This was not a conversation. This was a ceremony. Humanity was expected to walk to the center, accept the document, and sign it. At the center of the floor stood a table. On the table sat the compliance accord. It was bound in something that looked like leather but probably was not. Beside it stood Sara. Sara was the council's primary ambassador for new species integration, which was a polite way of saying she was the one who delivered ultimatums. She was tall, built like something that had decided to become a diplomat only after trying several other options first. Her exoskeleton was the dark copper color of old machinery. Her compound eyes caught the light in a way that made it impossible to know where she was looking. She did not greet Arda. She gestured at the document. Arda walked to the table. She picked up the compliance accord. It was heavy. She turned to the first page, then the second, then skipped to the middle, then to the end. Dav stood very still and tried not to look at the 11 alien delegations staring down at them. Arda set the document back on the table. She looked at Sara. "No," she said. The word was not loud. It was not angry. It sat in the air of the assembly hall the way a stone sits after you drop it into water. Everything rippled outward from it. Sara's mandibles moved. "You do not understand the consequences of." "I understand them fine," Arda said. "The answer is still no." The hall erupted, not in one voice but in 11, overlapping, each species reacting according to its own tradition. The Dravi delegates stood and spread their feathered arms wide, which meant something serious in their culture, though nobody in the human delegation was entirely sure what. The Lu amphibians in their water-lined section made a sound like a pipe organ played badly. The insected gallery nearest to the floor began clicking rapidly among themselves. Sora held up one arm and the noise dropped. She was very good at that. "The accord is not optional," she said. "Every species that has entered galactic space has signed it. Every species." "Then we will be the first that does not," Arda said. "You do not have the military strength to resist council." "We're not resisting anything," Arda said. "We are declining. Those are different. You are welcome to disagree with our decision. We are not interested in changing it." She picked up her bag from the floor. She looked once more at the document on the table, at the room full of ancient, powerful species who had built stations the size of small moons, who had treaties stretching back further than human written history, who had never once considered that a new species might simply say no and mean it. Then she nodded politely at Sora and walked toward the exit. Dov followed. He was sweating through his jacket. Behind them, the hall descended into an argument that would last 11 hours and resolve nothing. On the shuttle back, Dov finally spoke. "They're going to sanction us. They're going to blockade our trade routes. They could freeze every human account in galactic banking." Arda was looking out the viewport at the station growing smaller behind them. "Yes," she said, "probably." "And you're not worried?" She thought about it honestly. "I'm worried about the soil erosion study," she said. "The Eastern Steppe numbers are worse than anyone is reporting. The council stuff will sort itself out." Dov stared at her. She turned a page in her book. The sanctions were announced on a Tuesday. By Wednesday, 17 different council member species had quietly sent private messages to Earth's Trade Bureau asking whether the sanctions applied to existing contracts or only new ones. By Thursday, the answer was technically yes but practically complicated, which is the kind of answer that keeps lawyers employed and everyone else confused. The council had designed the sanctions in 3 weeks. It normally took them 4 years to agree on anything. The speed was meant to be impressive. What they had not done in those 3 weeks was ask a single economist to look at what they were sanctioning. Human food exports had been running for 80 years. Earth had a way of growing things that required almost no modification for most biological systems in the galaxy. Something about the soil composition, the microbial diversity, the fact that humans had been selectively breeding crops for 10,000 years before they ever left the planet. The result was food that was cheap, stable, and worked. 41 species ate it. 11 of those species were council members. Human medical compounds had been in circulation for 60 years, not the advanced ones, the basic ones: antiseptics, anti-inflammatories, clotting agents, the kind of thing you did not notice until it was gone. 14 species used human-derived pharmaceuticals in their standard field medical kits. Human reactor cores powered small and medium stations across 12 systems, not because human engineering was the most advanced. It was not, but because human cores were simple, modular, and could be repaired by anyone with a basic toolkit and a downloaded manual. 38 orbital stations ran on them. The sanctions froze all of this. Week 1 was fine. Everyone had stockpiles. Week 4, the Peth Nomad fleet sent an urgent message to the council reporting that their food recyclers were struggling, and they had been counting on the next human export shipment to supplement protein reserves for their outer colony clusters. Week 6, a Lu medical station near the Dara system reported a shortage of wound-sealing compound and asked which council-approved alternative they should use. The council sent them a list of 3 options. 2 were not manufactured anymore. 1 cost 11 times more. Week 8, a mid-sized Dravi orbital station lost primary power when its human-built reactor core needed a replacement part, and the supply had been cut. They switched to backup. Backup lasted 9 days. Sora received a report on Week 9 that used the word crisis 14 times. She sent it back asking them to use a different word. They sent it back with the word emergency instead, 14 times. What the council had not accounted for was this: humans did not panic, they reorganized. Within a month of the sanctions, Earth's Trade Bureau had already mapped every affected route, every affected species, and every affected contract. They had not done this to look for loopholes. They had done it because Arda had asked a simple question to her trade team: which of these species actually needs what we provide, and are any of them not council members? The answer was interesting. Of the 41 species that ate human food exports regularly, 18 were not council members. They were smaller civilizations. Independent systems. Species that had never been invited to sign anything, because the Council had not considered them significant enough to bother with. Arda sent personal letters to all 18 of them. Not digital signals, not diplomatic frequency bursts, letters, on paper. She had made a note about that after the Council's first letter arrived. Something about paper said you had taken the time to decide what to write. The letters were short. They explained that Earth was currently unable to fulfill existing export contracts due to political circumstances outside Earth's control, but that Earth remained committed to finding a solution and would like to speak directly if the receiving party was interested. 16 out of 18 wrote back within 2 weeks. The other 2 showed up in person. One of them was a small gray-furred species called the Os, who had 6 colony ships and a deep and practical interest in not starving. Their representative arrived at Earth's orbital station, looked around at the port facilities, and asked whether humans needed anything in return. Their ships were fast, faster than anything the Council operated on similar fuel consumption. They had been trying to sell transit contracts for years, but the Council's preferred shipping guilds had blocked them at every application. Arda met with the OS representative for 2 hours. At the end, she offered a food export deal and a transit partnership. The OS representative accepted both and said, with what translated as great dignity, that they had been waiting a long time for someone to ask. Back in the council chamber, Sara stood before the full assembly and reported that the sanctions were working. Trade numbers with Earth were down. There had been no contact from the human diplomatic mission requesting renegotiation. Voss, the reptilian elder who chaired the assembly from his raised seat, asked one question. Have humans contacted anyone else? There was a pause. We are monitoring that, Sora said. Voss looked at her with his old flat eyes. That is not the same as no. The assembly moved on, but Voss did not. After the session, he sat alone in the chamber for a long time, looking at the star map embedded in the floor, thinking about a species that had said no and then gone quiet and started writing letters. He had seen that pattern before, just never from a species this new. The fleet was Sara's idea, and everyone knew it. 22 warships, not enough to destroy anything significant but more than enough to make a point. The plan, as presented to the Council Assembly, was a show of presence. Park the fleet at the edge of human-claimed space, broadcast a formal demand for renegotiation on all standard frequencies, and wait. The assumption was that humans, seeing 22 armed vessels sitting at their doorstep, would make contact within 72 hours. The fleet departed. It took 11 days to reach the outer boundary of human space. What they found waiting for them was nothing. No ships, no defensive formation, no response on any channel, just the usual background hum of a busy star system going about its business, freighters moving between stations, mining operations on 2 asteroid belts, a passenger liner on a scheduled run between Earth's second colony and a way station near the border. The Dravai fleet commander, a heavily feathered veteran named Grawl who had run 14 of these presence operations and never once had to fire a weapon, sent the formal demand broadcast and waited. 72 hours passed. No response. He sent it again and waited another 48 hours. Still nothing. On day 6 of the standoff, a single human transmission came in. It was not from a government channel or a military frequency. It came from a personal comm unit registered to a human called Bren, listed in the registry as a station defense coordinator at the outer platform designated Waypoint 4. The message was audio only. A man's voice, relaxed, slightly muffled, as if he was talking from a comfortable distance away from his transmitter. This is Waypoint 4. We see you out there. No rush on our end. Take your time. That was the entire message. Grawl spent 40 minutes deciding how to respond to it. He sent back a formal reiteration of the Council's demands and a warning that continued noncompliance would be interpreted as hostile intent. The response came back in about 10 minutes. Understood, still no rush. Grawl requested advice from the Council. The Council sent a committee recommendation in 4 days, which was extremely fast by their standards. The recommendation said to maintain position and increase broadcast frequency. Meanwhile, on Waypoint 4, Bren was doing his job. His job, for the past 6 months, had been overseeing the construction of 3 new defense platforms around the outer station ring. The work had been scheduled long before the Council's situation started. It was routine infrastructure. The platforms were not weapons-heavy by any military standard. They were detection and relay stations with hardened hulls and enough point defense to discourage pirates. But they were being built, and the construction crews were working double shifts. Every day Grawl sat with his fleet at the border, Bren's teams finished another section. Docking clamps, power routing, sensor arrays. The workers ate their meals in pressurized modules bolted to the half-finished frames and went back to welding. Nobody made speeches about it. It was just work that needed doing. On day 11, one of Graal's junior officers submitted a report. The report noted several things. It noted that no human military vessels had appeared. It noted that no hostile transmissions had been received. It also noted that since the fleet's arrival, the number of non-Council ships passing through human space had increased by about 30%. Small ships mostly. The fast gray ones registered to a species called the OS. Some Peth colony vessels. A few unregistered hulls that matched profiles from independent systems. The report concluded with a question that the junior officer had phrased very carefully, so it did not sound like what it was, which was, what exactly are we accomplishing here? Grawl did not answer the report. He sent another broadcast demanding renegotiation. Bren replied 9 hours later. We got your message, still doing fine over here, hope you are too. On day 13, a Dravai crew member on one of the smaller escort vessels filed a formal morale complaint. It was the first one Grawl had ever received in 14 operations. The complaint said, in the formal language required for such documents, that crew members were experiencing difficulty maintaining operational focus due to the unclear nature of the mission objective, and requested either engagement orders or return orders, as the current state of indefinite waiting was affecting psychological readiness. Grawl read it twice. Then he wrote engagement orders were not authorized and return orders had not been received, and that crew should focus on maintenance tasks during the standby period. 3 more morale complaints arrived within a week. The Council sent a message on day 19 asking for a status update. Grawl wrote, Fleet remains in position. No human military contact. No response to formal demands. Human construction activity in the area continues. Non-Council traffic through human space continues to increase, awaiting further instructions. He sent it and then sat in his command chair and looked at the distant lights of Waypoint 4. 3 new structures had appeared around it since he arrived. They were not pointed at his fleet. They were not pointed at anything in particular. They were just there now, solid and lit up, full of people doing ordinary work. On day 20, a journalist from a Dravai independent news channel published a piece. The headline translated roughly as, Our fleet has been sitting at the human border for 3 weeks and the humans have not noticed. The piece was not entirely accurate, but it spread fast. Bren read it on his personal tablet, laughed once, and went back to reviewing the sensor array installation schedule. Platform 2 was ahead of time. That was good. The thing about cracks is that they do not announce themselves. They start somewhere small and internal, in a place where the pressure has been building quietly for longer than anyone wanted to admit, and then one day something ordinary happens and the whole surface shifts. For the Council, The ordinary thing was a water shortage on a Lu colony called Desmar. Desmar was not an important colony. It had about 40,000 residents, a fishing industry, a modest trade port, and a desalination system that had been running on a human-built filtration core for 22 years. When the Sanctions cut the supply of human replacement parts, the filtration core began to degrade. The Lu Colony Administration sent a request to the Council for an approved alternative. The Council took 6 weeks to respond. The response listed 2 alternatives, both of which cost more than Desmar's annual infrastructure budget and required installation by specialists who were not available in that system. The colony began rationing water. The Lu delegate to the council, an elder named Foss who had served for 30 years and never once raised his voice in the assembly chamber, raised his voice in the assembly chamber. He did not shout. He spoke very clearly and slowly, which was worse. He asked how a decision made in this hall by species who had never visited Desmar and could not find it on a map without help had resulted in 40,000 people rationing water. He asked which member of the council had reviewed the humanitarian impact of the sanctions before voting. He asked this question and waited. No one answered. Foss sat back down. He did not look angry anymore. He looked like someone who had already made a decision and was simply waiting for the right moment to act on it. 3 days later, the Peth representative, a nomadic elder named Wura, who conducted all her council business from her colony ship, which was perpetually docked in the station's outer bay, appeared at the door of Arda's cabin aboard a human transit vessel and knocked. Arda answered the door. She recognized Wura from the assembly. She stepped aside and let her in. Wura did not sit down. She stood in the middle of the room and said in flat, direct Peth, which the translator rendered with equal flatness, "We did not want the accord either. We signed it because we were told there was no other option. You told them there was another option. We want to know if it applies to us." Arda looked at her for a moment. "Sit down," she said. "This will take a while." Wura sat. They talked for 4 hours. By the end, Foss of the Lu had joined them. By the following morning, a quiet insect-like delegate from the silicon-based owned species had sent a message asking if there was a meeting he should know about. There was. He joined it. None of them were defecting. None of them were announcing anything. They were just talking, asking questions, doing the thing that the council had spent decades training its members not to do, which was treat other species like they might have something useful to say. While this was happening, a young Lu journalist named Pilo was doing something different. Pilo worked for a small independent news service that the council had never bothered to suppress because it had never had enough viewers to bother with. She had been covering the water shortage on Desmar for 2 months. In doing so, she had pulled every public record she could find on the Compliance Accord's origins. What she found was not a peace treaty. It was not a framework for mutual development. It was a contract drafted by the 5 original council species, before any of the current 11 members had joined, designed to ensure that any new spacefaring species would enter the galactic economy in a position that made them dependent on council trade, council banking, and council military protection. The language was very careful. It never said control. It said integration. It never said dependency. It said alignment. But the numbers in the appendices said something simpler. Every species that signed the accord spent its first 50 years of galactic membership buying more from council suppliers than its own economy could afford, borrowing from council financial institutions to cover the gap, and repaying those loans by opening its resource sectors to council extraction rights. Every single one. Pilo broadcast the full report on a Tuesday. She did not have many viewers, but she had enough to start a chain. By Thursday, 3 larger outlets had picked up the documents. By the following week, the report had been translated into 41 languages and was being discussed on worlds that had signed the accord decades ago and had simply assumed the terms were normal because no one had ever shown them an alternative. In the council assembly, Sora demanded the broadcast be classified as hostile disinformation and suppressed. The vote to suppress it failed, not because the members who voted against it were brave, because enough of them were already angry about Desmar and the medical shortages and the failed reactor parts, and the vote gave them a safe small way to say so. Voss did not vote either way. He sat in his elevated chair and watched the tally and thought about Foss, who had served 30 years without raising his voice, and about Wura, who had been docked in the Outer Bay for 8 years and had never once been personally consulted about anything. After the session, he called in his senior aide and asked for a full list of all council members who had initiated any informal contact with the human diplomatic mission in the past 90 days. The aide brought the list. It was longer than Voss had expected. He read it twice. Then he asked his aide to find him a contact channel for Arda that did not route through the council's official communication system. His aide looked at him. "A personal one," Voss said. "Paper if possible." The letter from Voss arrived in a sealed physical envelope, delivered by an own courier, who handed it to Dov without a word, and left before Dov could think of what to ask. The letter was short. It gave a set of coordinates for a neutral station in unclaimed space, a date and a time. It said, "Just you, no aides, no delegation, no record." At the bottom, in handwriting that looked like it had taken effort, it said, "I think we have both been patient enough." Arda showed the letter to Dov. He told her not to go. She told him she had already decided to go and was showing it to him out of courtesy. He asked what courtesy meant in this context. She said it meant she was telling him where she would be. The station the coordinates pointed to was operated by the OWN, the silicon-based species who had been quietly attending Arda's informal meetings for the past month. The OWN did not eat or drink in the biological sense and did not need atmosphere the way most species did, which made their stations genuinely neutral ground because everyone was equally uncomfortable on them. The air was technically breathable but thin. The temperature was kept at a level that was cold enough to make you think about it without being cold enough to matter. The lighting was white and even, without shadow. Arda arrived first. She found the meeting room, a small gray space with a round table and 2 chairs, and sat down and waited. Voss arrived 11 minutes later. He was larger in person than he appeared from a distance in the assembly. His gray-green scales had the worn look of old stone. He moved carefully, not slowly, in the way of someone whose joints had opinions about movement but whose will had stopped listening to them years ago. He sat across from Arda and looked at her with the flat measuring expression she had seen on his face in the assembly hall every time something unexpected happened. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Voss said, "You used paper." "You used paper first," Arda said. Something in his face shifted slightly, not quite a smile, an acknowledgement. He folded his hands on the table and said, "I want to understand something, not officially. I want to understand it personally. When you refused the accord, did you know what would happen, or were you making a choice without knowing the cost?" Arda thought about it. "Both," she said. "I knew there would be costs. I did not know exactly which ones, but the accord would have cost more." "How did you calculate that?" "I read it," she said, "the appendices especially." Voss was quiet for a moment. "Most species don't read the appendices." "I know." He looked at the table. "I wrote part of those appendices," he said. 110 years ago, I was a junior trade architect. I was told the terms were necessary for stability. I believed that." Arda did not say anything. She waited. "I have been managing what those terms created for 80 years, he said. "Every council session I attend, I am managing the consequence of a decision I helped make when I did not know enough to know better. The system does not work anymore. It has not worked for a long time. I have kept it from collapsing through." He paused and seemed to be choosing a word carefully. Through maintenance, not repair, maintenance. Why are you telling me this? Arda asked. Because you broke something that was already broken and everyone is treating it like a disaster, he said. And I want to know if you actually have something in mind, or if you simply said no and hoped for the best. Arda put both hands flat on the table. I have something in mind, she said. She talked for almost 2 hours. She did not use notes. She talked about what the Lu had said in their informal meetings, what the Peth needed and did not have, what the Own had been observing for 60 years from the outside of every room they were technically allowed to be in. She talked about the 18 non-council species who had written back to her letters and the 2 who had shown up in person. She talked about what a replacement framework could look like if it was built around what species actually needed, rather than what the founding 5 had needed when they built the original. She talked about a round table where nobody's chair was higher than anyone else's. Voss listened. He did not interrupt. He did not check anything on any device. He listened the way someone listens when they have been waiting a long time to hear a particular kind of thing and are not going to risk missing a word of it. At the end he said, I cannot publicly support this, not yet. I know, Arda said. Several council members will resist it. Sara will resist it loudly. I know that too. You could be building something for years, and it might not hold. Arda nodded. Things that hold are usually built slowly, she said. Voss looked at her for a long moment. Then he said something that his translator rendered as, You are a very strange species. Arda considered that. In what way? You act as if the outcome is already settled, he said, but you have no guarantee of anything. You are operating entirely on, he searched for the word, commitment, without certainty. Yes, she said. Why? She thought about Desmar's water shortage, about Wura sitting in the outer bay for 8 years and never being asked anything, about Pilo's broadcast reaching 40 billion people who had simply never been shown the appendices. Because someone had to start, she said. Voss stood to leave. At the door he stopped without turning around. I will not obstruct what you are building, he said. That is the most I can offer right now. Arda stood. That is more than I had this morning, she said. He left. She sat back down and stayed in the thin, cold air of the Own station for another 20 minutes, thinking through everything that needed doing next. The list was very long. She found that it did not feel heavy. It felt like work that had been waiting for someone to pick it up. She picked up her bag and went to do it. The station had no name when construction started. Halfway through, the OS workers who were doing the hull section started calling it Kethvor in their own language, which translated as something between first door and the place before the place. The name stuck. Nobody officially approved it. It did not need approval. That was, in a small way, the point. It was built in unclaimed space, equidistant from 11 different systems, on a design that no single species had drawn. The OS contributed the frame. A Peth engineering collective handled the internal atmosphere systems. Lu biologists designed the water filtration. Human teams built the reactor cores and the communication array and the medical bay. The OWN consulted on the structural stress calculations and said nothing else and did exactly what they said. It took 14 months. The day the first session of the Open Assembly was scheduled, 31 species sent delegations. There was no ceremony, no procession, no document signing visible to cameras. The doors opened at the appointed time and people walked in and found their seats. The seats were all the same. The table was round. The ceiling was high enough to be comfortable but not so high that it was trying to say something about power. The lighting was warm. Someone had put a small plant in a pot at the center of the table, which had caused a brief logistical discussion about whether plants sent a message, and the conclusion had been that it just looked nice, and that was enough of a reason. Arda did not sit at the head of the table. She sat between the OS representative and a small, quiet delegate from a species called the Mav, who had 3 colony ships, no military, and a sophisticated tradition of water-sharing law that turned out to be very relevant to 7 ongoing disputes in the outer systems. The first item on the agenda was Desmar. Not symbolically. Actually, the water shortage was still ongoing. The new assembly had no formal power yet, but it had something more immediately useful, which was 31 species in one room who could ask directly, who has what, who needs what, and how do we move it? The OS said their fast ships could carry filtration components from a human manufacturing station to Desmar in 9 days. The Lu confirmed which components were needed. A human logistics coordinator named Sati, sitting in the back row of the human delegation, because Arda had specifically asked the senior people to sit in the back and let the working-level staff sit at the table, confirmed that the components were available and could be released within 48 hours. The whole conversation took 22 minutes. In the old council, it would have taken a committee, a subcommittee, a formal request, a review period, a count review, a budget allocation vote, and 4 months minimum. Foss of the Lu, who had served 30 years and raised his voice once, sat very still during those 22 minutes. Afterward, during the break, he found the corner of the corridor where Arda was drinking something warm from a metal cup and stood beside her without speaking for a moment. Then he said, 22 minutes. Yes, she said. He nodded and went back inside. 6 of the 11 council member species had sent observers. They sat in a separate section and did not formally participate. One of them, a Dravi officer named Rail who had been on Graal's fleet during the border standoff and had filed one of the morale complaints, was attending as a private individual on personal leave. She sat in the public gallery and watched everything and took notes in a small book she had brought herself. Sora had issued a statement calling the Open Assembly an illegal parallel structure and a direct challenge to council authority. The statement was covered by 7 news outlets. Pilo's follow-up report on the Desmar resolution was covered by 43. The session ran 16 hours over 2 days. 3 disputes were formally acknowledged and assigned working groups. 1 trade agreement was signed. The MAV water-sharing framework was accepted as a starting template for resource dispute mediation. 2 species who had been in a low-level conflict over an asteroid belt for 11 years agreed to pause hostilities and send representatives to a mediation session the following month. Nobody gave a speech about it. It just went on the schedule. On the last evening, after the formal session had ended and people were eating in the common area, and talking in the informal way that often moves things further than official sessions do, Arda sat alone for 10 minutes near the viewport looking out at the star field. Dov found her there. He sat down and did not say anything for a while. "How do you feel?" he eventually asked. She thought about it honestly. "Tired," she said, "and like there is a great deal more to do." "There is," he said. "Good," she said. Back on the council station, Voss was in his office reading the session summary. It had been sent to him by one of the observers, not officially but personally. He read it carefully. He read the part about Desmar twice. He read the part about the MAV framework and looked up the species in his records and found that the council had assessed them as too small to merit formal engagement on 4 separate occasions over the past 30 years. He sat with that for a while. Then he opened a personal document on his private terminal, not a council file, a personal one. He had been adding to it for years, slowly, the thoughts he could not say in the assembly and the questions he could not ask out loud. He added 1 line. It said they asked the MAV. He closed the document. He looked at the star map on his wall for a long time. Then he opened a blank message to Arda and started writing, slowly, the way someone writes when they are choosing every word. He did not send it that night, but he finished it. He would send it in the morning. Outside, in the corridors of the council station, things moved the way they always moved. formal and careful and slow. But somewhere in unclaimed space, a station with no official name was turning its lights on for the second day and setting out chairs that were all exactly the same height, and 31 species were walking back in to continue a conversation that had started when one tired older woman read the appendices and decided that no was a complete sentence. The galaxy did not change all at once. It changed the way most things change, one person asking a real question and someone else, finally, having the room to answer it.